So, hello everyone to the 16th FairTalk of Fairpicture with the title "Whose Story Is It?" An introduction to Fairpicture CLS, and CLS is our short term for community-led storytelling. I'm Daniel. I'm with Fairpicture now since more than 4 years and responsible for operational business for our visual productions and account management. I'm your moderator for today, and I'd like to introduce you now to our panelists. So who do we have? We have Tom. Tom is a humanitarian photographer and senior lecturer who developed community-led storytelling methodologies for social change, built on the conviction that contributor ownership is not a nice to have, but the whole point. His work has taken him from Morocco, where a project with indigenous Amazigh women won the Emerald Published Real Impact Award, or to Rwanda, where participatory filmmaking with young people directly shaped the country's national youth mental health strategy. He's now one of our Fairpicture's lead facilitators for CLS. We have then Michelle Walls. Michelle is a senior lecturer and photo voice practitioner who co-developed CLS methodologies for social change alongside with Tom. Her work centers on giving communities genuine creative authority over the stories that concern them, moving beyond documentation toward real co-producing and ownership. Together with Tom, she brings a methodological background to Fairpicture's CLS project. Then I'm very happy to welcome Elizabeth Bourne. Elizabeth is a communications lead with over 14 years experience in the international development sector. Currently, she is the head of communication at War Child. But Liz previously held senior communication roles at Saferworld, where she led the organization's work on how conflict-affected communities are represented in public storytelling. She brings to today's panel the perspective of an NGO communicator who has spent years grappling with exactly the question this webinar centers on: who has the right to shape the narratives that influence public opinion? I think Marie hasn't joined us, right? Anyway, I just wanted to shortly say something about it. She would have been our panelist for the perspective of a Fairpicture visual creator. She is Nairobi-based and has a background that's as rare as it is fitting. She has a BA in peace and conflict resolutions combined with a specialization in cinematography. But you will get to know her on another date. Then we have also Eric Kabera in the room. Eric is one of the most important figures in African cinema. A Rwandan filmmaker and the founder of Hollywood, Rwanda's own film industry. He built the Rwanda Cinema Center and Kwetu Film Institute from the ground up, driven by one conviction, that Rwandans should tell their own stories, not have them told by outsiders. His film 100 Days, the first feature shot in Rwanda after the genocide, was made entirely with survivors rather than professional actors. His life work is, in the most concrete sense, community-led storytelling. Thank you for all joining us today. I think that will be a very interesting webinar and discussion. And before we start with our panelists, let me briefly share how we all ended up in this room and introduce you to our path to CLS, or yes, it's the Fairpicture's path, but it also has very much connection to my own story. It was in 2021 when I was still working for a German NGO where I experienced the very first time, the work with a local visual creator on a project called the Impact Diaries. The idea was as simple as it sounds: empower cocoa farmers who participated in the Living Income Project to tell the impact of that project through self-recorded videos. We held a workshop with the community, provided them with smartphones from our partner, and helped them to share their own stories. With again trust and knowledge Fairpicture local creators, together with the Coco community, created a follow-up on their own, this time without any Western being around. And until then, I hadn't come up with a name for it yet, but I felt that something was different to all the other content gatherings I did previously, something with the contributors and with their stories. Genuine pride, greater self-confidence, and more authentic stories. When I joined Fairpicture shortly after, I gained a broader look about the sector, where and who are the drivers of innovation, what changed in terms of storytelling, and what stayed the same. When I look back today through the lens of Fairpicture, I would mention three aspects. Major NGOs signed pledges on decolonization and localization over the past years. And also many organizations today work with local visual creators. Something Fairpicture started with went from edge case to the new norm, which is really great. Same goes for consent. We are all aware of it. But when it comes to story ownership and co-creation, real co-creation, we have to admit that our sector hasn't changed just as we would like it to be. Plus, with the latest development of AI, authenticity is not anymore a nice to have thing, but a real fundraising risk. Yet studies have long shown that the risk of an organization takes when it shifts ownership of stories to those who experience them pays off. For example, this study from AMRE from 2022, where Kenyan community healthy workers designed and authored the fundraising materials. It's still worth a read. But we couldn't see the change in our sector yet, even though there were exceptions and innovative trials among our clients. So anyways, we more and more knew what was missing and what it needs to build a localized form of CLS, which is scalable and could lead to a service for all our clients. And these are the 3 points. We need experienced facilitators, at least for the start. We already have a wonderful network of visual creators where some are just waiting for such a shift in the character of an assignment. Plus, they bring the craft to the workshops and guarantee that our clients not only walk away with contributor-owned and authorized stories, but also with compelling visual material. And a transfer model. It is part of our DNA at Fairpicture to work with locals wherever possible. That's how we started, and this is how we go on, step by step, making CLS really locally led. So this is just for an introduction. So what's the plan for the next 40, 45 minutes? We will now hear a case study from Tom, a project he planned and executed in South Sudan, sorry. Shortly, we will have a short panel discussion together with Elizabeth for her perspective as a communications expert. This will be followed by the presentation of Fairpicture CLS approach by Michelle. Then it's the time for your questions. You can, by the way, put your questions anytime in the chat. We have Noah with us here in the room who will sort all questions, and at the end of this talk, of this webinar, we will have the time to discuss or to come back to all of your questions. And then we have a short wrap up at the end and explain how you can become part of it if you like. That's it. And I'm now happy to hand over to Tom and give you the floor.
Hi, thank you, Daniel. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this call. It's really great to see so many of you and so many people interested in different ways of storytelling within this environment. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a background about how I came to participatory methods within the humanitarian sector. And it's quite interesting to hear Daniel talk about his experiences, because I sense a lot of the people that I speak to who work in participatory ways come to them quite organically through experiences that they've discovered in the field. And I'm no different there. So my background is as a humanitarian photographer. So I work with clients like the United Nations and the European Commission, photographing projects, and also smaller donors. And or if you could go to the next slide, Daniel, that'd be great. Thank you. And as I was working in the sector, I found there to be repeated challenges that I was facing personally around what I was being asked to do, and how I was treating the subjects that I was working with in terms of telling stories, but also aestheticizing and creating images that was as highest impact as possible for the audiences that I was creating images for. And there were all sorts of ethical challenges I was juggling while continuing to work as a freelancer. But feeling like an outsider looking in, and then pressure to create images that conforms to Western aesthetic sensibilities, looking at generating visual impact rather than focusing on the people and their stories and putting and foregrounding those. And I would talk about how images can have a utility, as in they can be useful for certain things. So some of the work that I did, if you move on to the next slide, involved working with human rights lawyers in Burundi, photographing violations of human rights for various reports, so they could be used to advocate for change. So I could see how these sorts of images could have a utility to have a real impact with the people who I was photographing, but I still found the relationship that I had as an outsider to the communities difficult. So it was when I started working with the NGO Saferworld that we discovered a slightly different way of working. Well, it was a brief from their point of view, and I was asked to, instead of photograph people from my own perspective, but actually to work with people and train them to take pictures themselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and about how that worked. But before that, I'm going to go into a little bit of the kind of the theory behind this situation of being an outsider looking in. I teach in the university, so I can talk a lot about these things, but don't worry, I'm going to keep it fairly light. But I think what's quite easy to forget when we look at an image is that we're not necessarily really just looking straight at the subject itself. Often what's more important or as important is the relationship between the photographer and the subject, which we can miss because it's behind the camera, but actually it can really change the mechanics of the image and how the image is constructed and what it's really saying. And there's a really simple example of this that I can show you on the next slide. So just to explain how important it is the relationship that the photographer has to the subject and why they're there taking the image. These are two images taken approximately the same time of the same event. And some of you who are photography nerds or appreciate photography might recognize Robert Capper's photos of the Normandy beach landings, Omaha Beach. And so what we have here is a photographer who was briefed to capture the human side of what was happening here. So he landed with the soldiers and created images of their experience. But at the same time, overhead in an airplane, we have another photographer who's taking a picture of the same place at the same time, but from a different point of view, from a strategic point of view. And this photographer's images are being used to make strategic decisions about how to direct resources and things on the battlefield. So the brief is the same, but the image itself comes forward in a very different way. And I think this is quite interesting when we start looking at different ways of telling stories and how important the relationship is between the subject and the photographer. Great, I'll go to the next slide. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this experience I had in South Sudan. So this was quite a long time ago, back in 2013, but it had a really profound impact on how I work as a photographer. So I'd worked in South Sudan previously and been there photographing ex-child combatants with work with UNICEF when Saferworld reached out to me because they wanted to run a participatory project and they were looking for facilitators to do that. And because I'd worked in the area before and also taught, they thought that they would like to talk to me about how we could do that. So if we can go to the next slide. So, although I didn't know it at the time, this is an iteration of community-led storytelling. So, rather than an external visual creator coming in and taking pictures of people, the concept was to work with people to produce images that could have impact on several fronts. So, there are some clear changes here, such as the community members develop stories themselves. Stories are created with the communities and led by them, and they also document what's shared. But I think what's quite interesting is that there's an impact with the participants which goes beyond purely the creation of images. And there's this fundamental shift from it being an extractive process to a co-creative process where participants themselves are able to shape how images are produced and how their narrative is formed. The next slide, please. So there are three cycles to how this process works. So the initial and most important is a genuine dialogue. So that's a conversation with the people, identifying challenges, defining what matters to them. Then there's a process of image making and training to create images, where community members create stories, and then also crucially important, some form of action to take place after the project's happened, after the images have been created. And this can be in terms of how they can be used as advocacy materials, but also action within the community, which I'll touch on in a moment. Next slide. So it was really interesting, this project, and Liz might be able to mention more about this after I've finished this section, but it formed part of their community security program that they were working on. So Saferworld were looking at ways to work on developing safer communities rather than in a top-down approach, working kind of with communities themselves to generate safety within those communities at that level, which linked into the United Nations HDR report, Human Development Report. And the idea was this photography project to slot within that program. So it would involve communities to build a sense of ownership from their wider community safety and security. It provide first-hand visual and oral material, so actually directly from the participants themselves, to be used for communications, funding, and advocacy work. And then also to provide a baseline for regular updates and continued images and feedback coming from the field, and providing stories of change and impact. So that was the brief, which was really fascinating. So here are some photographs from delivering the training in Kwajok. So Kwajok is a town in the north of South Sudan, quite close to the border with Sudan. The people that we were working with in the community were from across the community. So we had village elders, community leaders, journalists, members of the police, and members of the armed forces, all in a room taking part in this project. And what we did was we trained them to take photographs through some simple narrative exercises, and then had a discussion about subjects that were important to them to direct the focus of the project. And the first task that we did during the training section of this workshop was for the participants to go into the community in pairs and to create images of people within their community or things within their community that felt needed some kind of security or protection. And that wasn't necessarily to focus on vulnerable people, but it was looking at people or situations where support was needed. And after a couple of hours, the participants came back and presented the images that they'd made to the wider group. And this was the moment that things really opened up for me in terms of the power of this approach. So if you could go to the next slide. So, I've been working as a photographer and as a photojournalist in various communities. and attempting to engage with people's stories on a human level. And as an outsider, can be a very challenging thing to do in terms of our limited understanding of people's lived realities, and also access can be challenging, and just simply not understanding the various things that are happening in people's lives. And what became clear to me with this project is even after a few hours, the narratives and the images that people came back with from that brief exercise completely opened up my world in terms of what was kind of happening in this community and how to frame narratives that of issues that are affecting communities. So we had a woman journalist who was passionate about a situation where women were being imprisoned because their husbands had failed to pay dowries. So it was a clear infringement of their human rights, and there's serious gender issues there. We had police who photographed street children that they were having to arrest for stealing food. But then when the police talked about why they were having to arrest these children, they talked very emotionally about how they could see that their children were trapped in a cycle where they were unable to provide for themselves, so they were forced to steal. But then the police had to arrest them because that was their job, and they could see that really ongoing support was kind of actually what needed to happen. And then village elders talking about their experiences, and soldiers photographing their fellow ex-soldiers who had mental health challenges due to post-traumatic stress. So there's this really kind of broad range of issues that were affecting these communities, which were not visible from at least where I was standing before we ran this workshop. And after that moment, it became clear to me that traditional approaches to storytelling and engaging with communities would never really quite be the same again for me. The penny really dropped in terms of actually the power of being able to hand over some kind of control for that narrative production to communities themselves. And like lots of people on this call, I'm much more interested in stories that other people have to tell rather than necessarily my own perspective on things. I think things become really it's much more interesting seeing how other people want to reflect on their world. So yeah, and that was quite a profound moment to me. So since then, I've gone on to run participatory projects across the globe and research them as well, and work with a really broad range of different people. I've been very, very lucky to work with a really broad range of different communities, and working with moving image and still image and in different ways. But I thought I would talk about this first project because it was just so impactful in terms of the contrast between those traditional ways that I've been approaching photography and storytelling in the humanitarian sector, and then this kind of new approach. So one of the things to talk about is benefits to the community, and that's something that we're going to talk about here in more detail later. Is for this process to be ethical, the community that you're working with has to be put first before the needs of your organization, but also any kind of desires you might have as a storyteller. And there are several stages to that, such as consistent ethical representation, so communities deciding what they want to share and how it's framed, and then a collective approach as well. So so how it can be used and integrated within monitoring and evaluation and different areas. And then actually the impact of on the participants themselves in terms of their confidence and empowerment, and for them being able to shape change within their communities. And then actually the positive impact of taking part in an arts process can have quite a significant positive benefit to individuals as well. Oh, is there another slide?
Yes, there is. Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much. I didn't know that it was your first CLS project. But yeah, quite similar to what I shared because it has such a strong impact on ourselves and where we were heading to. Now I'd like to hear a little bit from Elise. You mentioned Saferworld was a client you did this project with, and your counterpart on client side was Elizabeth. And maybe as a first question, even it's quite a while ago when you worked on this project, but what is your first memory when you think back to that project, Liz?
Thank you, and thank you for the invite. I jokingly left Tom a voicemail that was like, by the way, I look quite a bit older than when we last met, so just be warned for that. Yeah, it was quite a while ago. Just when we first started working on the project, so I would say that this the photography element of this project was so much part of the broader kind of peace building project. So like we ran this in three countries in Bangladesh, Yemen, and South Sudan, obviously. And South Sudan was the first place we kind of started the part of the project and running that out. And I think my kind of first memories were actually thinking through at even the proposal stage how this would fit within the broader aims of the project, which were around like participation and community level peace building, basically. So I think my first memories are kind of thinking through how could this work across the different contexts and be led. So yeah, I did leave Saferworld in January this year, actually. And it's interesting to reflect back this long ago because I think that internally, this was the point when there was a real shift in how we approached communications as well. So I think that this was the point where we really said, okay, we're not handing over, but like, yeah, our communications and particularly our audiovisual will be led by our partners. And I think that while Saferworld's name was on this project, like as Tom was just mentioning, like the teams, the Saferworld teams, and also our local partners were really quite embedded within the community, and I think that that was really critical actually, because to not have that kind of real analysis of the situation, it could have been very sensitive. And I remember talking through a lot of these kind of risks basically for things to go potentially wrong. Yeah, so that's my kind of first memory, and I do think that it really pushed Saferworld to think properly about the content, the way that it was kind of gathering content or the processes that we were using, and pushed us to think about the images that we were using quite significantly, actually. And I think that, yeah, it's interesting having just sort of left, but I do now look back and think actually it did really drive us kind of forward. And Safer World, I still think holds those values quite strongly with the kind of audio visual leads now, actually. Um, and I suppose looking back and reflecting at this, I think one of my reflections of the fact that this is 10 years ago is that so much has happened in between. So yeah, like technology, obviously, massive one. So I look back now when we were handing out cameras, I'm like, oh, if we did it now, would we really go? Would it be Tom or me who went? No, I would say no. Would it be led by an INGO? No. Would the technology be different? And I think during that period, there has been this sort of reflection and yeah, I suppose like mixed commitment, I guess, around decolonization, or like commitment pledges, but like mixed follow through on that in real terms, in terms of communications by different INGOs. So I look back and think actually this was kind of the start of the thinking of Safer World around this area.
Thank you. So listening to you, it sounds that this project was the initial or the first one which created a change how you do communication. I can imagine that there were also backlashes. I don't know, from fundraising or from other departments. Um, can you also remember how you convinced eternally or advocated for this approach, for such a community-led storytelling approach, and
Yeah,
how
I
you
actually
achieved?
don't. Yeah, I can't remember there being a big backlash, but I definitely think there was a process of explaining the value of communications and photography as a communications tool to maybe some of their people who are a bit more, let's say, policy research crowd, basically, who could not quite see the value in terms of demonstrating to their target audiences. And so one of the things that we did, was distinctly like held photo exhibitions at the EU level, like in Brussels, in London, like in various, I think in Washington as well. So like we kind of reached out to that crowd. So I think there was a definite it did help to kind of flip the broader issue, which was that people weren't fully sold on the idea that communications had this big role to play in kind of like promoting community voices, I think. And I think now the challenge would be, I don't know, like the challenge now would be funding, and how you would convince at a point when funding within some areas is so tight, how you would kind of reiterate the importance of the need for this type of project, basically. But then I also think that from an INGO perspective, that you would support partners to push for this within their kind of fundraising and think about that. But yeah, I think like reflecting on it now, I'm not even sure this would get into budgets, because I know that the kind of like certainly institutional funding budgets are just so much tighter. So I think it would have to be just such a strong case again. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just the last question before we move on with Michelle. Is there anything you would do differently today, looking back at the beginning, things you learned through the whole process, and maybe also by external feedback you received, things you would do differently, or yes.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking there's a couple of probably really practical things I'd do differently. I think that, you would probably go into it acknowledging that maybe not all the photo, like that the purpose is not necessarily the output rather than the process. And I think maybe at the start of this, we were quite focused on, oh, let's get some really decent photos and see if we can pitch them and stuff, and actually slightly missed the point of the fact that this was about the process within communities of doing this. Yeah, as I said, I think I just don't, I don't think that a Saferworld would do this type of project now. I think we would approach it more like, okay, what organizations that we're working with in South Sudan, and could they do this type of project? Would they want to? How could we facilitate that? Like, how could we support, basically? So I suppose those would be the major changes if we did it again. But I think acknowledging that, maybe being slightly more realistic about what we thought we might come out of it, but then also acknowledging like the other kind of massive benefits that it did really shift thinking around kind of the use of photography and who's taking the image and who's telling the story. And I think that sometimes that can be quite sometimes when we kind of, I don't know, I have a feeling that within the sector, sometimes when we say, okay, we want more realistic images, that's quite a stylistic approach, and what we actually mean is a bit more like authentic, or like maybe like stylistically less polished, rather than actually thinking about like, actually we want people's stories and we want those stories to come. That's a bit pessimistic. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. Like I said, Marie, who would be the representative of a creator, is unfortunately sick. All the best from here to Nairobi. But we will leave a link in the chat, because Laura, another creator from Lebanon, just participated in a CLS project with one of our clients, the DEC in UK, and she shared her experience in form of a really great blog article we will share in the chat. And now we move on with Michelle and presenting Fairpicture's community-led story telling
Daniel,
approach.
sorry, can I
Yes,
just hop in there? I'm really sorry to derail you. I just wanted to kind of really quickly reflect on a couple of things that Liz said, if that's okay, if we have time.
sure. Okay.
Great. Yeah, first of all, apologies for making you remember something from so long ago, Liz. It was a long time ago. But I only have two very short points. The first one is actually reflecting on that project. Something that really comes to mind is now I've had experience working on a lot of other projects, is actually how important the role was of the local partners that we were working with, and actually the skill that they had to be able to bring those people together in that room, and the amount of work that would have taken place to do that was quite incredible, and facilitate that discussion was like. Yeah, especially around such sensitive subjects. So, and at the time, I kind of didn't really appreciate that, but now I really, really can, So that was amazing. And then also, just a quick note, what you were saying about images kind of being taken seriously from a policy point of view, or in terms of knowledge or feeding into projects themselves. And I think that's something that across academia is an issue as well in terms of qualitative research and visual qualitative research in general. And it's just quite interesting. But there does seem to be a kind of a shift taking place and a value being put on visual storytelling as an approach that has kudos that can be used to help inform decision making. But those are the two things. And yeah, thanks. Yes.
Thank you, Tom. And now to Michelle.
I'm just smiling here, sort of appreciating Tom's geeking out on loads of the points of Elizabeth's talk, because there's loads of things I'd love to pick up on as well. But I'm going to try and focus on just talking through our approach and the methodology, because I am mindful of time. It was interesting that Tom ended on benefit to communities, because actually, if you look at the three-stage approach that we've got here, the foundation part, actually, Daniel, if you go to the next slide, please. So you can see that we have a foundation, we then move on to a core process and then outputs. And the foundation part of this work, we believe, is really, really important, because it's here that you really foreground the benefit to the community that you're working with. So we look at it like this. We have a context and relationship building part of the project. This is before it begins officially on the ground. And this is really where you take time to understand the local context, build relationships, and identify any of the practical, cultural, or ethical considerations that may shape the work. Those kind of things have already just come out in terms of what Tom was talking about in Sudan. So it's getting all of those things right from the outset. As I said, this stage is so important because it sort of helps ensure that the work that you go on to do is appropriate, that it's inclusive, and that benefit to the community is really clear from the start. What I think is incredibly interesting about what Fairpicture can offer in this space, and it's something that I think, Tom, you'd probably agree with, this is extremely rare in our experience, is that they're going to have these trained local visual creators on the ground who can lead and manage those logistics and relationships before the sort of main body of the project begins. I think that is beyond valuable personally in terms of just the whole ethics and sort of success of this kind of work, not just in the foundation stage, but what it offers for longer term engagement and evaluation as well. So that's the first stage. Then we move on to recruit and build relationships with participants. That's still in the foundation stage, Daniel, if you just the previous slide. We would always approach this as a collaborative and inclusive process. You don't just kind of go and pluck people out of the community at random. It's about really thinking very carefully and collaboratively about this. It's about looking for a diverse range of experiences and perspectives within the community. Ideally, you seek to avoid reproducing any existing inequalities that are there or privileging only the most visible voices. So throughout that kind of process, ethics is front and center. Transparency, accessibility, and also safeguarding and ongoing consent are all built into that stage of the recruitment process. So they're kind of keystones throughout. So that's your foundational work. You have the sort of relationships, you have the participants, you have a degree of clarity, and you move on to the next stage, which is the core process. So the first stage of that, collaborative framing and co-design, this is really, really important phase. One of the things that we're trying to be incredibly conscious of here is that this kind of work is not ethically meaningful if participants are only going to be able to reinforce pre-existing institutional narratives. And obviously, projects will typically begin with existing NGO priorities or funding frameworks. But this stage here, where you collaboratively frame and co-design with participants, is absolutely crucial because it creates space for participants to really help shape the direction and themes and focus of the project in a meaningful way. What we are categorically not asking participants for here is for feedback on a finished plan. It's about letting them be active agents in shaping that work alongside sort of NGO aims and priorities. So you have participants, Fairpicture facilitators, visual creators, partner organizations, through discussion, through reflection, through shared decision making, coming together to collaboratively establish the scope of the project and determine what the shared expectations and responsibilities and approaches are. One of the key things here, I think, to do this work well is that facilitators need to be really aware of the power relations that can exist in that kind of process and structure those dialogues in such a way as to mitigate against that. Because so often, especially if some of this kind of work is perceived as addressing a need within a community, people can feel quite, I suppose, encouraged to provide the kind of images that they think are expected of them or that they think people want to see rather than perhaps what they actually deeply want to communicate about. So it's just been really aware of that throughout this process. And at the end of that sort of stage 3, we should end up with an outcome that's really clear, it's really collaborative, and it's ethically informed. This sort of framework that encompasses all of that before you even begin making images. Then you go on to the fun stuff, the visual storytelling and image ethics. And this is typically workshops. They're usually really lively, really creative, where facilitators support participants to develop the practical image making skills that they're going to need to create the work. That's often around things like creative expression as well, storytelling, visual communication. And also, especially in larger projects and where there's the space and capacity to do this, alongside those kind of basic mechanics of storytelling, we also get participants to think about representation and audience and visibility and the responsible creation and sharing of images within community-led storytelling. Eric on the call, I would imagine, would remember we were doing a lot of work around this in terms of representations of mental health when we were working with the young people in Rwanda, and especially making sure that we weren't just leading with sort of Western conceptions of that as well, really drawing on African visual motifs and metaphors in terms of looking at that kind of work. So that's the sort of visual storytelling aspect. Again, there's so much you can do here. It just depends on the scope of the project, but you can also build in, if there's space and time, explorations on how images can communicate experiences and perspectives and ideas in different ways across different contexts. There's loads of work you can do, but essentially here it's about creating a strong sense of visual literacy and the technical and creative sort of confidence to create images to talk about the stories they want or to show the stories that they want to share. So then you move into participant-led image making. That sort of sounds like what the title of it says. The participants create images that reflect their own experiences and perspectives and ways of seeing. Again, here, ethics has to be front and center. So facilitators would always be watching during this phase for participant well-being, for ongoing consent. Sometimes people consent to exploring a particular thing or sharing a particular type of image, and then when they see it, they can change their mind and feel uncomfortable. So it's just been really mindful of that stuff and making sure the participants understand that consent is ongoing. It's not a one and done kind of situation when it comes to this type of work. You'd be thinking about respectful representation, having dialogue around that throughout this whole process. Another thing that's incredibly important here, and again, it sort of was touched on in some of what Elizabeth and Tom were talking about, was the facilitators need to be really attentive to the risk of unintentionally shaping narratives here or influencing visual outcomes. that has to be something that you're really mindful of, and just making sure that it's the participant's experience and perspective and way of seeing that's foregrounded. So then we move on to collaborative image review and decision making. So this is one of my favorite bits of the process. Participants come together to review and discuss images through guided reflection and group dialogue. So it's all of the things that you would expect to happen here happens. So you have image selection, there might be captions put on those images or further contextualization. In the work in Rwanda, for example, there was a lot of sort of dialogue around the images that the women created in that project that were then sort of transcribed into a book, so image and text together. And all of this work helps ensure that photographs really remain connected to participant perspectives and what their intended meanings are. So again, ethics here is so important. So participant choice around visibility, representation, image sharing, ongoing consent, thinking about different audiences, all of that is part of what comes into this stage of the project. I suppose, and hopefully you can see from what I'm saying that ethics and ongoing consent are really woven through all of the stages of this process and kind of reappear in different ways throughout. So that's the core process finished. We move on to outputs and reflections. I think this is where, actually, I think all of the stages of this work is exciting, but I think this is where it really, I think, deviates in really significant ways from some of the more traditional approaches in terms of what can happen with these images and the forms they can take and the work that they can do in the world. So outputs are collaboratively developed and shared in ways that reflect the aims of the project, the needs of participants and intended audiences. And this might mean a number of different things. It could be community engagement, it could be advocacy, it could be organizational or program learning, it can be monitoring and evaluation, public dialogue, policy conversations. It really just depends on the context of the work. We've been involved in all of those different type of approaches, the work that Tom and I have done together, and it works really effectively across all of those contexts. And the outputs themselves can take a range of forms depending on the needs of the community, the partners, again, and project aims. So you can have an exhibition of the community images with the captions and reflections. You might have co-produced publications. You could have documentary videos, photographic process documentation. You can have evaluation and needs assessment, reporting, audio and written storytelling. I mean, there really is so many options in terms of what can happen with these outputs, and it's really exciting. And then this final and crucial part of the process is collaborative reflection and routes to change. So with this type of work, that impact in terms of responding to what the community has identified and seeking positive change is so important. So again, there's ongoing reflection, dialogue, and learning following the sharing of the work. And we also would encourage organizational partners here to engage with the experiences, concerns, and perspectives that have been identified throughout the project, which would help inform future conversations, relationships, and potential areas for action or routes to change. And this work is incredibly impactful and effective at doing that. I'm aware of time and I could talk for days about this because it excites me and I love it. But I'm going to stop there because I'm also aware there's a load of questions that I haven't read.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, before we come to the open discussion and the questions, I'm not sure if there are so many, but please feel free to type everything in. Before we start to the conversation, I have just one question for you. So listening to you, and we already knew it before, that's why we have chosen you and Tom to become our facilitators for CLS projects, and with your long time experience, with the adapted Fairpicture setup, bringing local visual creators to the team. What will change, or what change does this approach bring to former ones, and where do you see the main benefits?
I think it's incredible, honestly. Like I would say it would genuinely would be the gold standard of how you do this type of work. I mean, I can just speak from one experience that Tom and I had in Rwanda, where we went and began a project that was building on an existing phase of work that had happened with local partners who would have been able to do some of the kind of work that Fairpicture visual creators had done. And we commented at the time that it was just such a different experience, this feeling of just hitting the ground running, because there was that established trust already there from the work the visual creators had done and that partner organizations that they had engaged with had done. And that is so important, like that trust with a community, it takes time to develop. So that having already some work around that already being in place is huge. I can't begin to say how important that is. But just making sure that the benefit to the community is foregrounded and those kind of conversations can happen organically and well in advance of the project beginning. That's really important as well, because realistically with budgets, you don't tend to be able to do that type of thing until you fly out to do a project. And I think you're trying to sort of put that on to the start of a busy production schedule. And it's not the ideal way to do it at all. So I just think this is going to be incredible. But the thing as well that I think is so exciting about it is that we've already seen from work that we've done the capacity this approach has for long-term monitoring and evaluation and assessment of impact. And we all know that the struggle with that typically is doing that assessment over a longer term. It's very easy to do it at the start of a project to assess a baseline and measure something else at the end. And there's all kinds of creative and clever ways of doing that now. But what you rarely ever have is the opportunity to check in 6 months down the line or 3 months down the line or a year down the line. As soon as you have visual creators with Fairpicture who are more embedded locally in that context now, that opens up a whole world of that kind of work that's possible. And I think that's really important and it's really exciting. So yeah, big fan of this approach, I have to say.
Yeah,
Thank you,
a
Michelle. Oh, and Tom.
comment that's come up in the questions is about how the visual creators in the Fairpicture network, how they're involved. And I just wanted to reiterate with Michelle is the idea with this approach is to train facilitators within that network. So it's not, again, people coming in from outside and facilitating projects. So the idea is that we'll run several projects and work with the local creators and train them. And then ultimately, the idea is that we step away and it's hands off from our point of view. And we've got local creators actually running and facilitating the projects. And the way that we were looking at working with those is if people already have skills, because lots of people have already worked in this way. I've noticed in the comments, Amina, who's already working in similar approaches. So the way that we would like to work with the creators within the network is to kind of meet them as individuals and collaborate on producing projects to train people so that they, so we kind of take on board skills that they already have as well.
All right. Noah, are there any more questions in the chat which haven't been looked at?
There is one that I think is interesting. Many questions actually. So one is to all of the panelists, and the question is: have any of you used kind of special project philanthropy to fund community-led storytelling when institutional budgets fall short? So we heard that these projects can be pricier than others, maybe. What's your experience with that? Is that a possibility? I think it could be interesting.
I haven't, but I'm sure it's possible.
Do you mind if I just wanted to clarify because I feel like maybe I was unclear in my chat. I think that what I meant was I do think that if you're adding participatory photography projects, which I've always struggled to say, into an existing project, then that is tricky from an institutional funding perspective at the moment. But if you're actually just pitching this as like a separate project, I definitely think there's places to fundraise there's quite a few. I'm happy to have a kind of look around and put some suggestions in the chat or follow up afterwards.
Any more questions?
And there's another question, one that was put as provocative, maybe. Now we have heard a lot about kind of the value of kind of a more inside perspective. The question is, are there circumstances where kind of the outside perspective is the one that counts or that should be valued more? As a provocative question. Anyone wants to react on this?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like I want a cup of tea in about 20 minutes to sit with that one. I don't know about the rest of you.
I don't think it's a question of insider or outsider views. Like, I think it's problematic, isn't it, to say that anybody is an outsider? I would say, like, so by outsider, do you mean like people coming in from the outside? Or, yeah. I mean, I think plurality is always interesting in terms of sort of telling stories from different points of view.
Yeah, it is. But it's like those two images you shared at the start, Tom, from Robert Capa. It's just a radically different perspective on things. And sometimes, admittedly, with a more advanced aesthetics, typically if it's professional image makers making the work. But what was the question we needed when would it benefit the process?
Liz, did you have your hand up as well? Sorry.
Not on this question, so I can pipe. It was in response to another question, so I can pipe it up.
Does anyone else want to jump in? I'm still pondering it.
There are several more questions in the chat, but I think they all lead quite far.
How do you go on an applied to bigger
So, is it worth bringing Eric Kabira in? For some reason, Eric's handle is Tom Martin, so I'm not sure why. But I wonder, as we have Eric here, if it'd be worth bringing him into the conversation.
Should I jump in?
Just a second, because we are
Sure.
We are now running out of time. I'm happy to stay longer, and I think there is interest in the room. But just for those who need to leave, let me just give you a short wrap up. So how can you follow up with Fairpicture's CLS approaches? So if you are interested in doing a CLS project with us, just for your information, we are planning up to 3 pilots this year. We are already in discussions with the first clients who are interested. We have some open seats left, and we will provide a 40% discount because it's a pilot, and we will learn on that way. Noah will put this link into the chat. It's just a one multiple choice question. If you're interested this year, next year, or not convinced yet, just leave us a short message and we will come back to you. You can always, of course, stay connected to us and get the latest infos on LinkedIn or with our newsletter. Or if you already are convinced, you can also book a call with me and discuss further. Maybe that's also interesting for you if you have a project in mind in your organization which might be a fit for community-led storytelling. We are happy to hear from you. All negotiations in the beginning until you have received a proposal from us after the consultation with Tom and Michelle, and we had a deep look together with your colleagues into this approach or into this project. You're not obliged to buy anything. Just if you like the proposal and like to go on, we would make a contract. But yes, our goal is to do the first pilots after the summer, or to start after the summer with the first pilot that start now with the planning phase. So this is just a wrap up. So everybody who needs to leave, thank you very much for attending, and I'm happy to stay some 10 minutes longer at least to hear definitely Eric who made it to this call. I'm very thankful for Eric.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you for everybody who has made their presentation. I think at first I thought like I'm really sitting in a masterclass. Thank you, Tom and Elizabeth and Michelle for these incredible presentations that you shared. And I was just wondering, for me, is it more of a question and also a contribution to where we are as an institution and with our sort of record of recording and capturing sort of local images and local stories. So the question that I have is this project going to be like the continuation of what is there, or it's actually something that is going to be designed to be embedded into the local communities sort of initiatives? So that's was the first question. So the second rather contribution is we have a new project that is actually into the concept level. It's called My Legacy Project. As you know, Africans are more of storytellers orally. So we wanted to start a project that record African storytellers or African sort of community and families and individuals on how to literally keep their memory alive. Because once you see, like in families, grandparents or parents, happen to pass on, and then the grandchildren will never know the face or the voice of the individual who has passed on. So this is something that we have actually proposed to the Ministry of Civic Education in Rwanda and the Ministry of ICT, and they are very, very much interested in embarking on such a project of oral history recording that captures the voices and memories and wisdom of individuals and families and communities, so that their story can actually be kept. So I was just throwing this out so that in case this is something that can be either considered or looked into that particular perspective, because in most cases, Africans tend not to write, or world over now, people tend to look at things on their phones or visual storytelling. And I had to approach the Columbia University, and because they have a department of oral history. So these are things that I think within the framework of getting community and families and organizations on the grassroots that can actually embark on, so that they can actually focus on their challenges, their opportunities, and their aspirations. So those are the two things that I wanted to bring forward. And thanking you all for organizing this. And it's very the methodology and the approach is very professorial. So I enjoyed every bit of it.
Thank you, Eric. Does anyone like to react on that?
So it was nice to hear your updated projects, Eric. You do such great work. Is that all through the Quato Institute?
Yeah, it's literally the continuation of what we did together, because after we did the focus on mental health advocacy and using really kids, I mean, there was a kind of sort of a gap where you felt like, so after this, what next? So you can see that the community really needs to continue on that path of creating their own stories and stories that matter to them. And once we can actually continue in that particular perspective, then we can reach out to various organizations, various communities, and with the help of Fairpicture, I think that that could eventually yield some really solid result. But at the end of the day, yeah.
Sorry, Eric, go on.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, this project can't come at the right time, because these conversations are going on, and we need literally to figure out, who would be the next partners, and how do we bring in, the local community, as we did with the previous project, which was hugely successful. As you remember, we brought in, mental health experts in the Ministry of Health and the community that came and really wanted more. So sometimes you want to do this, but you also want the legacy to be held or to be taken by them, rather than actually being sort of handled by expert. And that's what we have done within our institute, whereby we encourage the young generation or the other people to be the experts of their own history or their own stories, or to be the owner of their narrative. And Rwanda has actually become a symbol of all of that, within the part of Africa where we are in East Africa, and that has encouraged quite a number of people to appreciate the kind of sort of a movement to do that. And you do it without necessarily bringing a lot of terminology, scientific terminology around all of this, but you just make it simply and playful, and then they tend to enjoy it. And then otherwise people who are just regular kids and regular young men and women, they in a span of 8 months they become literally the image makers. I mean, like the young men and women who were trained in the last program, I mean, they went on and became great videographers, great storytellers, great editors. So these are the kind of things that we believe once it's properly introduced and put into their hands, and you give them the tools to play with, and with the knowledge, and with the 21st century kind of sort of model of learning, it catches pretty fast, and it's a great time to do these kind of things, and really to give the tools to the community in a fast pace.
That's brilliant, Eric. And it sounds really like we need to follow up this discussion with you. And I definitely will reach out to you after this call. I think we need to come to an end. Half of the attendees have already left, but let's finish with a last question to all of you. And if you could answer short, if that's possible. So if someone is unsure whether community-led storytelling is the right fit for his or for their organization, what would you say to them?
But I mean, my answer to that is like, if the community doesn't tell their story, who else will? Because I mean, from an African perspective, we have always been complaining about other people telling our own stories or defining like our identity and our cultural settings and many other things of a sort. So it's literally high time for us to take it as a mandate, as a responsibility, so that we can actually not show, but share. Really, it's more about sharing rather than showing or teaching. Because if you look at African literally narrative or storytelling, it's very beautiful. The landscape is beautiful. People are beautiful, and people know how to tell their stories. It's just a matter of just like guiding them or being around them and just participating and just have a life like we did in the last program that Michelle and Tom experienced. It's just like become a community kind of sort of sharing, and that's what counts the most, whereby people don't feel like being taken advantage, but they create a kind of sort of a humanistic kind of sort of environment of sharing and belonging, because at the end of the day, regardless of where we are geographically, we all have the same aspirations. We need to take our kids to school, put food on the table, shelter on the head, and hope for tomorrow.
Thank you.
Perfect answer.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I'm just trying to maybe to be
if it's not the
philosophical, but
community,
just...
who else would it be? I love that one.
Yeah.
Thank you all. That was FairTalk number 16. Some of you asked if you get this presentation. Yes, we will do. We will send a summary tomorrow to all participants. And for now, I just have to say thank you for your attendance, and have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing the call.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Like seeing you.
Thank you.
Bye. How do we live? That's another thing.